Hello, and welcome to another episode of my devlog. I'm Chris, and in this sprint, I mainly concentrated on fleshing out how I wanted to do the inventory system for my game, as well as making long strides on the character animation system, specifically the artwork for that. I don't have a bunch of code this sprint because I was out of town half the time, didn't have access to my workstation, but I have some exciting things I want to talk about, as well as some art demos I want to show you. So let's just jump into it. Alright, so as you can see, we're at the Trello Planning board, as we always start out with, and I've got a couple things done this sprint. As I mentioned before, the base character sprite sheet, the animation that I was working on, the art, and then the inventory system planning that I was doing, planning out exactly how I want to implement this inventory, which is going to be a pretty lengthy process ultimately when it comes down to it. And then I updated this featured document. And basically, if you remember way back when I introduced the game mechanics documentation into my process, it's basically a way to make sure that any feature I'm adding to the game, I'm adding for a purpose, specifically any game mechanic I'm adding. And then if I decide to remove a game mechanic, I'm removing it for a purpose as well. It helps me avoid clutter and make sure I'm always on track and always knows what I'm doing when I implement it. So basically, in this case, as you can see, we still have the justification for our transitions, our player character data, and then I've added customizable inventory system. I'm not going to read all of this to you right now. It's mainly to help me be able to understand it. You can pause the video and read it if you wish. But basically, the idea is I want a customizable inventory system that's fun to use, that discourages the players from just hoarding items and thus backing themselves into a corner where inventory management is no longer a fun process but a tedious process, and allows the player to have personality in the game through their inventory system. All right, so don't want to get into that huge because it's more important to kind of show you what I've come up with, what exactly I want to do. So if we move over to Asprite, which is my pixel art paint software, we can see I've sketched up a few different options, the prototypes, if you will, for how this inventory system is going to work. So let's back up before we get into what this image is and what I'm trying to do here. So basically what I want is to move away from the common way of doing these inventory systems to a method that is a bit more enjoyable as the player. Let me explain this in this kind of way. Think of how it's usually implemented, how inventory is usually implemented as inventory and space. So basically you've got your inventory, which is the items that you own. The player owns maybe apples, swords, maps, scraps of paper. So that's their inventory, the things they have. And then where those items go in the game is just some empty space. It might be fluffed up with a bit of art, and it may look cool, it may play into the game, you may even be able to increase the space. But that's all it is, just space for the items to go into. I want to back away from that inventory space notion to an inventory storage notion. These terms, inventory space versus inventory storage, aren't terms you're going to hear in game development. I'm just making them up to help me be able to understand what I'm doing. But basically the difference is, instead of having your inventory go into just some space that might be variable in size and that's about it, I want to have the notion that that space itself is a part of the world. So it doesn't just look like it because your character's walking around with a backpack, but it actually is part of the world and it carries its own significance. The idea is, even if there's no items within that storage, it still exists in the world, and it still affects play style and individuality within the game. So if we look at these different items, just to explain that a little bit more, we've got three different inventory spaces right here. We've got something like a messenger bag down here in the bottom left. We've got maybe a backpacker's backpack up here. And then we've got that, that Japanese wicker basket thing that you sometimes see people wear in old movies or in animes. I don't know what it's called. Probably should have looked it up. But that right over here. And each one of these has a certain number of inventory slots. They have small inventory slots, medium-sized inventory slots, and larger-sized inventory slots. And ultimately, they're going to have other attributes that go along with them. So this could just be inventory as space if I left it like this. because it's just a made up space in the world and it just looks kind of cool. But I want to have more variability to these different spaces. Instead of just space, I want there to be weight. Maybe material will factor into it. Maybe different packs can give you different bonuses, such as hidden slots or side pouches or hooks to hold different weapons. And then some packs would naturally be more cumbersome than others. For instance, a messenger bag would be a pretty easy thing to wear in most situations, whereas you probably don't want to be wearing this massive wicker basket on your back in a hand-to-hand combat or when you're climbing a cliff. So yes, it gives you more storage, but it isn't inherently better because it also brings around disadvantages. In some games, they'll make your character slow down if you're carrying too many items, but this would make you slow down and less maneuverable even without items inside of it, making it good for certain situations, but not good for others. And ultimately what this forces players to do is decide how they want to play. Do they want, or how they're currently playing? Are they currently in the city, taking notes, spying on some civilians or politicians? Maybe they just need the messenger bag. If they're going through for a massive backpacking trip across a desert, maybe they want something that can give them a lot more storage. Or if they're doing general adventuring, maybe they want something like this. Again, these are just prototypes. There would probably be more, and these are not set in stone exactly how they're going to be, but this is the direction I want to go. Inventory as storage, a more interesting, more mechanically significant way of making the players do inventory management where they can actually enjoy it and introduce their own personality in how they do items. Again, I want to go into this in a lot more detail and talk about the significance of how this changes most modern games' understanding of inventory management, but I don't have time in this video. So leave a comment down below if you'd like to see that. I'll probably do it, but it may have to wait unless people express a lot of interest in it, and subscribe to see that video later on. Let's hop over to Unity and check out the other thing I worked on this sprint. So that was the first one, inventory management. I planned that out, wasn't able to get into the code simply because I was out of town. But I did also add this new character sprite animation. So here he is right now. Obviously, there's not much to the character, and I'm going to be adding on the character's image later on. But this is just to give me a better understanding of how it works in the game. And if I go ahead and hit play, we can see it's very similar, but now it's got smooth walking animation, all normal directions, and now we also have the diagonal directions where the character can walk. It's a lot more frames, so it's a much smoother animation. There's a lot more head bob and body movement. It feels a lot more alive. There's a lot more interesting. It's just a lot more interesting than what it used to be. Now, there's a few problems here, though, other than the fact that I need to add color, add the character artistry to this character. First of all, seeing it in the game, now that I can actually see it, this movement right here, it's a little, I don't know, it struts a little too much. Look, the feet are sticking out too far forward, and I'm just not a big fan. I think it looks fine walking up at angles here, but I think I need to move the feet back into the body and make them not stretch out so much. The angled positions. Another issue I have is the side views are just, well, they're terrible. I don't like them. The problem here, in my mind, is basically what we're running into here. Why I think this looks bad. You may like it, but I think it looks bad. And the reason is because what we're aiming for is not a short, squat character. What we're aiming for is an angled camera view. So this would be a maybe normal-sized person with an abnormally large head. Yes, I'll grant you that. But the camera's looking down at them, so it's not that their body and legs are super small. It's just that we've got an angle. And you can see that at most positions. You can see that we're looking down on them until we look up from the side. And then there's something about this that looks like we're looking straight onto them, which makes them look out of place in the world. Why are they walking along the ground on their side? And also it makes all of their proportions look off. From here we can kind of see, okay, their body's smaller, but that's because of the angle. Here the body doesn't look smaller because of the angle, it just looks smaller in general. And the same with the legs, and it makes the head, even though the head is the same size in all directions for the most part, and it makes the head just look massive because all of the proportions are off all of a sudden. I didn't notice really what was a problem with this when I was working on this inside of Sprite, but importing into Unity, it just stands out like a sore thumb, so I'm going to have to redo this angle, which is fine. It's just like 10 frames movement. And then I'll be happy, hopefully I'll be happy with it so I can move on to add some texture to the character and give it life. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is the angled position. So basically how I've built it is there are 16 different animations. 8 for all the 8 directions that the character can walk, and then 8 more for the idle equivalent of that position. So an idle position facing down is what the animation the character is in right now. This is technically its own animation of one frame, them just looking down. So there's one for all of these directions. However, you may notice that when I try to walk this direction, like at an angle, the idle animation sticks to one of the 2 other directions. You see I'm pushing up like this, and now he's facing upwards instead of that angle, which is what it's supposed to happen. The reason this is happening is because the idle animation is chosen based on the direction the player was going right before the idle animation is supposed to kick in. So basically, the game recognizes that I'm pushing to the right, and so it implements the walk right animation. And when I stop moving, it notices that we're not moving, checks to see what direction we were going previously, and then sets that as the idle animation to implement. Unfortunately, when we're pressing keys, we're not absolutely perfect with them, and when we lift up, we usually lift up one key before the other. And so technically, the moment right before I stopped moving was either down or to the left or to the right, depending on which finger happened to come up afterwards. I didn't expect this to be a problem. I really hadn't thought about it, and truth be told, most people solve this simply by only having 4 directions they make the character walk in. But this is something I'm going to have to address. It may be really hard. I'm sure other people have run into this and solved it, so I should be able to solve it. I have a few ideas, but that's just where I'm going in the future. Also, I've noticed that, as a side note, if I use a controller, then it's all wonky. Like, that's just weird. I know why I'm hard coding values that I should set as ranges, but I want to address this as soon as possible in the next sprint as well. So this sprint kind of brought up a lot of issues that I need to address now, not things that I can't overcome. All in all, I'm really glad with what I have. I like the animation. It feels alive, gives the character character basically, and still works with the door and everything. So that's where we're going. That's what I have for this sprint. And so that brings us to the end of another sprint. Coming up, I plan to fix the issues I addressed at the end of the video and finally get around to actually implementing that inventory system I planned for so much this sprint. I expect that'll take the entire time, not sure. Either way, that's a topic for the next video. If you like this video, please leave it a like. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.